What's up, guys, and welcome back. Jane Jaw is probably the best it's ever been in Marvel Snap at the moment, and today consider this like the only guide you'll ever need on how to operate and pilot the deck. Now, personally, I've used this deck multiple times to climb to infinite throughout the last few seasons. It's pretty damn consistent, and it's great at rapidly climbing ranks. Now, today I'll break down the core cards, the best combos, multiple decks depending on your collection, and of course, turn-by-turn strategy to master even the smallest of details that really matter when piloting Jane Jaw. Now let's go ahead and start with the core cards of the deck. Not too many here, but of course we have the good dog Lockjaw, who is obviously the heartbeat of the deck, and it's going to be our first pressure card. I've used that term a lot, and essentially you want to use Lockjaw to contest a lane. You don't want to put him in a lane that your opponent's not committing to because, well, Lockjaw is going to oftentimes win the lane that he's in. You can never truly count yourself out when you have Lockjaw in different cycles as long as you're tracking your cards that you put in and the cards that come out of your deck. And that is the main objective of the deck. Get these huge power cards out there or cards with solid abilities early and cheating them out earlier than they should play. One thing to know is like you always want to play your cheap token card, obviously, first. You can only cycle once now compared to the old versions. So Mjolnir, the Wasp, those are the things that you want to go in. And then you can sometimes take big advantage of this later, especially like turn 6. You play, let's say, Thor's Hammer, and then you can play Chavez in the Lockjaw lane safely to give you a bit more dependability if you happen to just pull a bunch of crap. And then the last thing I want to say is if you get Subterranea or you play like a Rock Slide that gets a ton of rocks out with like Camartage, you probably lost. Like, Lockjaw loses its value a ton when there's multiple garbage in the deck. So, again, keep all that in mind. Now, typically, Thor is not played across multiple decks because of the RNG and randomness of his stat boost. But with Lockjaw, we have a much better chance to get him powered up, and then combine that with the fact that we have Jane Foster, and you're pretty much always going to get that hammer out there for Thor. Now, we'll talk on this more later, but Thor is definitely one of the best win conditions in the deck. He's great against the control meta at the moment. Just having that nice scaling power, your opponent doesn't really know if you're going to get the hammer if you don't play Jane. Him and Jane alone typically can hold down at least one location, and you can oftentimes get him to like 16 power, which is just awesome. Also, he doesn't climb past that 9-ish threshold for Shang-Chi, typically till the end, right? So they can't get rid of him early. Really like him. One thing that people don't know, though, is Mjolnir does shuffle your deck, and it can cause some weird interactions, like Jubilee can pull America Chavez after this happens, so do keep that in mind. Now, outside of the name of the deck, obviously including Jane, there's not a lot to break down about the card other than you want to play her on turn 5 when you can. You know, when you have Thor and her together, odds are looking pretty good that you're going to win the game. And when we get to the strategy section, there's a lot of little things that you can utilize with Jane Foster. But probably the best part about Jane is she is 8 power, so she can't be susceptible to Shang-Chi. But the worst part about her is that your opponent then knows that you absolutely have the hammer. So you kind of lose the surprise factor when boosting up Thor. But with the way the deck works, it doesn't really matter all too much because you can just nuke out a ridiculous amount of power. Now, also as an added bonus, obviously from the deck, you can also call Wasp back to yourself. So you can use them as token cards, and then you put them back into your hand, and you can play them into Lockjaw yet again, resulting in what we've talked about, multiple power-ups to Thor and multiple free cycles in Lockjaw. Now, I will say Jubilee is a bit of a tough one in the deck. Probably the most replaceable if you want to include other things. I find it really good, obviously, to go into Lockjaw. But oftentimes, you're going to get enough tokens to get those cards anyway. So you can replace her. If you have Iron Lad, then probably keep Jubilee in there. But if you're playing another version, you can swap her out. I have her as a core card because if you get bad RNG, she kind of helps you out a bit more depending on your pulls. Now, at first, you're probably going to be a bit puzzled to see America Chavez as a core card in Jane Jaw, but as you guys know, consistency is key, and she's really going to help the consistency of what is already kind of an RNG deck. America Chavez has 9 power, first of all, so it's good to get her out of Lockjaw, but at the same time, she's going to help thin the deck, and this is vital to get Thor or Lockjaw in your starting hand. So there's no downside of having Chavez as you're looking to get big power, and you're getting a much more consistent result. Now, the core synergy of Jane Foster, Wasp, and Lockjaw is what pushes this deck to be competitive. Having that ability to get Wasp multiple times to cycle into Lockjaw, or if things are looking good, you can get her from Jane Foster and then not play her to ensure that you don't get her rotating out of the Lockjaw lane. The biggest thing that high Evo brings to the deck is something that I really didn't like about Jane Jaw, and that's Wasp. It felt so bad pulling Wasp out of Lockjaw, but now Wasp at least does something in the deck, and pushing that negative power over and over can feel really good if you keep getting her after you rotate her in Lockjaw. So really solid advantage you have if you do play the high Evo version. But again, we'll talk about multiple versions of the deck here in a second. Now guys, Dracula is definitely going to be a card that some people consider core, others not. You're going to see in the win rate best decks that it's typically in there, and that's because obviously it makes use of cards like Infinite or other big cards if you happen to pull them and you can't rotate them out of Lockjaw. Your Dracula is going to be a good, decent power. Not what you're used to, you know, maybe not the discard levels of power, but still, it's just a nice kind of failsafe that always puts that pressure on the opponent. As you guys know, there's a lot of pressure in this deck. And so if you have Thor going, Dracula, there's a lot to be said. Having him come out of Lockjaw can be extremely intimidating, but typically you want to play him in his own lane. Now, personally, one of my favorite pieces about Jane Jaw is that there's just so much flexibility in the deck. Now, I will say if you experiment too much, it will lead to more losses. Definitely, there's some better big cards than others. We're going to start with those, and then we'll jump into the other flexible options that you can plug into the deck. Now, for the most part, these are going to be the core big cards that you want to ensure you have in your Lockjaw, Jane Jaw decks, mainly because Infinite is Infinite. It's going to be 20 power. But at the same time, having Dr. Doom and Odin is always clutch. First of all, Dr. Doom is great on any turn, coming out of Lockjaw, playing on turn 6, getting into tough-to-reach locations. And then Odin not only can proc Dr. Doom a couple of times, but now we have Odin to proc Wasp. You have him to proc Thor an additional time. Mjolnir and him together is a super important play to have on turn 6 for even more power. And we have other cards with on-reveal abilities that we can synergize with Odin. All of this combined is why we have all these three into the must-includes as well. You can play a Jane Jaw deck that has a bit more lower-cost cards to guarantee more cycles, or you can be more on the greedy side and ensure that you always get a nice pull. So obviously, cards like Thanos is going to completely change the way that it works. But Giganto and Magneto, both very solid options that you could include into just about any Lockjaw build. If you do go the Odin route, then Arrow and other on-reveal cards might be a bit better. Nightcrawler, Vision, naturally really solid as you can move them out of the way and is a decent fill option if you don't have other cards to slot in. As well as Jeff, who's just a good card to begin with, but because of his movability as well, always solid. Leech has kind of lost his play because of the quote-unquote nerf that happened to him. But in this deck, he can punish so many meta decks at the moment that are reliant on these combos. And so Leech is something that I would definitely consider as well. Captain Marvel just takes out some of the RNG. Sunspot is always solid for the first couple of turns if you have nothing else to play. And you can combine that with synergy with She-Hulk. Again, guys, like feel free to mix and match with all these different combinations of cards. You know, I will say that most of these have been tested, and the ones that we have today, the decks I'll show, are the most tried and true and probably consistent big cards and other flexible cards to include in your Jane Jaw. But that being said, people expect those cards, and, you know, the element of surprise is always something to think about. But if you happen to be one of the few, or one of the many, I guess I should say, that got high evolution, this is really transforming Jane Jaw and is the new updated Jane Jaw. And there's a lot of cards to include that you get for free with high Evo. Obviously, the Hulk is going to be our biggest, best card, and really the main thing that just amps up Jane Jaw. Having the ability to just have a pretty much infinite power card at hand that you could play on turn 6 opposed to Infinite. And naturally, you're already skipping so many turns in a Jane Jaw deck, which is what makes it even stronger. But Cyclops, Misty Knight, these are just good cards to have, whether they come out of Lockjaw or Misty Knight for a nice token card that isn't the worst thing to pull. You can go the route of the Thing and Abomination so that you have Odin in the deck, triggering Thing multiple times, spreading negative power, and then obviously Wasp is already included, which is going to give you free plays of Abomination. Really solid. It does add a bit more RNG, but I've seen consistent results there. Now, with all that, guys, like the high Evo version isn't like colossally better than the version without him. You're trading like lower cards and bigger power cards to have the Hulk and then high Evo, which is a card that you obviously don't want. But the threshold of what Hulk can become is what is so enticing. And then having Wasp there or even Shocker really makes the deck a bit more dependable, in my opinion. but the win rates are like really close, as you guys are about to see. Now, something I've been including in my deck guides more often is this kind of popular cards in the deck. I find this so like fascinating to see how popular each card is included in Jaw. Now, High Evo is a new card, so you're not going to see the numbers on that super correct, but even being brand new, you have a 22% play rate, as well as the Hulk at 32%. Obviously, that was much lower before High Evo came out. M'Baku is a cheeky option for those that, you know, just want to live life on the wild side a bit more. But as you can see, all the core cards that we talked about earlier are pretty much always included, with both Magneto and Dracula and Giganto getting a bit more of an edge here for those that probably don't have the High Evo version. Magneto is the one that I would say is probably the best big card that I didn't talk about a bunch today because of all the powerful 3 and 4 cost options. Magneto just messes up the game plan. A lot of discard decks right now, so Magneto can pull those Draculas over to one lane, giving you much more freedom to win the other lane. And then again, you have some of these movement options like we talked about before. So pretty neat to see this all combined on what is popular in a Jaw deck. All right, guys, let's move on to a bunch of different decks. We're going to look at the best win rate deck, the best cube rate deck, a budget version that's still extremely good, and then a personal favorite that I like to play that's a bit more risky, but I find it more fun and it can pop off in the right circumstances. Now, looking at the best win rate deck, this is definitely something I played right away when High Evo came out. We've got ourselves just pure big stats. There's nothing bad that can come out of Lockjaw. Only good, and you have the Hulk for the increased power. You have Dracula in this deck, which is always going to get good value. Looking at all the cards, it's typically going to always be about 8 or more power, which I like. Some people don't like Dracula, but it definitely can add to the play and give you a use if you did pull Infinite and not just waste the card. Now, this is going to be a much lower sample size, but I thought this was a very cool High Evo version of the deck that happens to have the best average cubes, about 1,500 games tested, and we're rocking close to a 60% win rate. Obviously, this deck is going to capitalize on also protecting you from the High Evo meta. You have Luke Cage in there to do so, but this is going to have Scorpion and Cyclops to push negative stats. You can have those obviously rotate with Lockjaw. Abomination is going to be a free play almost all the time with the deck. And then, of course, you still have the Thor and Jane raw power. So this can be great. You can add Odin to add even a bit more to the deck because of both Thing and Scorpion getting a good bonus from that, as well as Thor. Now, like I said, guys, do not be fooled with the budget version of the deck. Still a super solid Lockjaw, Jaw deck that you can play without High Evo. Again, you are going to sacrifice a couple of things like we've talked about as far as pushing negative power with the Wasp. But you're going to replace that. You're going to replace that High Evo with big power cards. It still performs at a great level. This is the one I used in previous seasons right before High Evo. This is the one that I've had on my underrated decks that we talked about on the Snapchat. So if you're looking to just kind of get in and your collection isn't huge, this is going to be the deck for you. I was looking at the High Evo cards and I had to use Shocker. There's just so much high roll with the deck anyway. And getting Shocker in there as not only a token card, but one that can also reduce the power of, let's say, Jane or Dr. Doom was too enticing to just pass up. Now, I will say that I would probably go with the core version, but once you've learned that, I find this a lot better for myself, and the results have been pretty damn good, because if Iron Lad does copy one of the cards like Hulk, Dr. Doom, even Odin or Mjolnir, you're getting a lot of value out of him. You can even go so cheeky as playing Howard the Duck in this. But altogether, really fun deck. Iron Lad's going to simply just boost the overall potential of the deck. And when things start popping with it, it's really hard to counter this. A lot of these are going to be under that Shang-Chi threshold, and it's a very solid performer. So those are going to be the decks that I would try out depending on your playstyle. But let's go into probably what is most important, and that is turn by turn and basic strategy. Now, to kick off the turn by turn, guys, we're going to start with a couple deck essentials. Now, first, we're going to talk about probably the most important, and that is when to snap. So usually, you're going to find this out after your own experience of playing the deck yourselves, but oftentimes, you don't want to snap without seeing all the locations at play for just a good rule of thumb to start out with. If I have like a great curve at the start of the game, like Wasp and Lockjaw and Thor, or if I have Thor and Jane Foster together, sometimes I might snap pretty early, just depending on the locations. But I definitely need at least either Thor or Lockjaw to have a good confident snap. Now, you'll need to trust the deck while you're playing it. It's probably one of the biggest things that I have to say about snapping. It's usually better to snap before you play your Wasp into Lockjaw or your Jubilee pulling out some big card, because you don't want to wait for the confidence on your side, because, you know, confidence to you typically turns into fear for your opponent. Now, another great snap is on turn 5 if you can play Thor's Hammer into Lockjaw, and then you can play Jane Foster right after that. You're just going to get so much power to Thor that usually you're going to pull off the win. So this is also a great way to snap. And just knowing what's left in your deck and what Lockjaw can pull, definitely going to be different depending on the game. Now, when it comes to retreating, as you guys know, getting to Infinite is a lot more than just a good deck. Plenty of things can screw you over, as you know, even with the best decks out there. And there's nothing wrong with just calling it quits and folding your hand if you get pretty screwed by RNG. It is typically unlikely, but if your opponent has like a huge board presence and you don't have Lockjaw or Thor and it's turn 4, it's probably best to retreat. If they haven't snapped, feel free to stay, but you're probably going to lose here. And then just for some last notes before we hop in, the deck does have some RNG, right? It is a Lockjaw deck at its core. So keep that in mind if you have a bad string of a couple games. So long as you retreat with low amounts of cubes, you're going to definitely make that up with your high cube wins. And then when it comes to things like Shang-Chi, just know he's real. He's out there. He's not a myth. So you're never safe no matter if you pull an Infinite in your Lockjaw lane. You know, don't fully commit that that lane is going to win. You need to focus on still maybe winning the others. Lane separation, you never want to play Thor and Lockjaw into the same lane. Or Dracula if you can help it. Lockjaw is just insanely great for pressure, and you need to have some other lane with high power, and that's going to be those two cards. And then, of course, you're going to be a lot better with this deck if you can keep track of your cards, and so using a deck tracker or just keeping memory of it is definitely going to improve your performance. I do have the deck tracker that I use down in the description below. You can download that. It helps a ton with a deck like this. All right, so the turn by turn, guys, starting with turn 1, pretty straightforward for both turn 1 and 2. Typically, you're going to play what you can outside of Wasp. You know, if you have Iceman, Sunspot, Misty Knight, some other one-cost drop that you customize into your deck. But most of the time, Jane Jaw decks won't have a lot of plays on the first couple of turns. Now, on turn 2, you'll be looking at the same situation. If you have Shocker and you have a pretty good card on the leftmost side of your hand, definitely feel free to play him now. Scorpion is sometimes in some Lockjaw decks, so you can play him as well, or any other 2-cost that might be a good time to play. Just don't play them into a lane that you want to have that Lockjaw on that you identify in the first couple of turns. Now, going into turn 3, this is by far the most confusing and most important probably out there that a lot of people have questions with. Now, if you have either Thor or Lockjaw, you're definitely going to want to play one of them, no question, right? Always playing Wasp into your Lockjaw if you happen to have it. But when it gets tricky is if you have both Thor and Lockjaw together on turn 3. Now, if you have Jane Foster, I typically lean towards playing Thor almost all the time. If you don't have Jane, it's kind of up to the given situation, but I still typically lean Thor unless I need Lockjaw out there for a specific reason. If you don't have either, you can always go for like the Hail Mary Jubilee. But more often than not, things are looking, again, somewhat grim if you don't pull any of those by turn 4, or if you don't have, let's say, Sunspot out there to soak up the energy. Now, lastly on this turn, guys, like control is everywhere at the moment. Professor X, Storm, so you want to probably put Thor to contest that lane, obviously over Lockjaw. Sometimes it can be advantageous to play Lockjaw and Wasp into that and get like an Infinite, and then you win the Storm lane. But oftentimes, just go with Thor. It's a much safer choice. They can't Shang-Chi it, and usually you can top them on power. Now, on to turn 4, guys. This is where the fun begins. It can always be a bit tough to explain exactly what to do here, as every match is very different on what you pulled and the locations and what deck you're playing against. However, some good rules of thumb is if you play Thor on turn 3, you're going to want to play Lockjaw and Thor's Hammer if you happen to pull that, or Wasp on this turn into a lane that doesn't have Thor in it. If you've played Lockjaw and Wasp on turn 3, you want to play Thor now if Jane is in hand. But you can also play Jubilee into Lockjaw if you played without Wasp. You don't want to kind of clog the Lockjaw lane all the way up. You need to leave a little bit of space to keep your opponent on their toes. And then also, depending on your deck, Dracula, Iron Lad, Killmonger, all are great options if you have nothing else to play on this turn. Now, in turn 5, guys, it is always, always, always the Hammer into Lockjaw, followed by Jane Thor. This is going to be your main win condition, and you're typically going to win at this point, and you should have snapped already. Now, sometimes they can be split on where to play your Jane. You can put her on Thor's lane, You can contest another lane if you feel the need to. But oftentimes, having your lanes with Thor and then your Lockjaw lane is going to be enough to win. Now, if Lockjaw hasn't been played, obviously this is now when you want to play him. If you don't have Jane Foster, this is where you're going to want to play one of your cheap cards into Lockjaw and then play something else into another lane. If you're lucky, you might get Jane Thor out of Lockjaw or some other big card. Now, if you've had awesome RNG at this point, this is one of my favorite things. You just want to skip turn 5. If you have Infinite and you have awesome RNG, you might as well just play Infinite and maybe Thor's Hammer on turn 6. And so that is kind of a one-off case. The last note here on turn 5 is if you happen to reduce something great with your Shocker, like Dr. Doom or the Hulk, definitely you're going to want to play that now. That's always going to be good value. Like Doom into Lockjaw, there's some great stuff you can do there. You can like follow that up with Odin. So that is going to be the advantage of playing the Shocker version of the deck. And going into turn 6, we have a few combos and decisions that you're going to make to seal up the win. The first one being Wasp into Lockjaw or Hammer into Lockjaw, and then Hulk on one of the other lanes is typically a winner. Also, Wasp into Lockjaw and maybe Hammer followed by Odin is always solid as well, just to get a lot of power over to Thor. Doom into Lockjaw if you still have some big cards in your deck, and the 5 across is going to win it for you. You could play Jubilee into a location or into Lockjaw if you still have big cards left. Just the Infinite play like we talked about earlier. Or if maybe you have Dracula out there and you have some low power cards in your hand, just getting rid of those is probably a good idea. And then, of course, our last option is always just American Chavez, followed by one of our zero-cost cards. Always pretty solid to get a nice cap of power. All right, guys, there you have it. That is everything you need to know about Jane Jaw. I did elect not to have battles on this one because the variance is so high. But for those that are missing those kind of gameplay and battles, do know I'll be having a lot of deck guides to come with those battles back. I just feel like this kind of keeps it a bit shorter. Guys, I want to remind you, we are on the way to 100,000 subs by the end of June. So if you haven't and you want to support, definitely means a lot. And until the next deck guide, as always, guys, happy snapping.